2 days later, I stood in the middle of Portland International Airport with a single suitcase, a ticket to Rome, and absolutely no idea what I was doing. I'd told no one. Not my mom, not my friends, not even my landlord. Part of me was terrified this was all some kind of elaborate mistake, that the moment I landed, someone would tell me to go home. But the other part, the part that sounded suspiciously like Grandpa's voice, kept whispering, "You'll never know if you don't move the piece." The flight was long, 10 hours of recycled air and quiet turbulence. The woman next to me snored softly against the window, and I couldn't stop staring at the envelope tucked in my bag, the one labeled in his handwriting, "Open only when you arrive." What could possibly be waiting for me in Rome? A letter? A test? Some distant cousin I didn't know about? When I closed my eyes, I saw Grandpa sitting across the chessboard again. That half smile that meant he already knew how the game would end. He'd always told me that real strategy isn't about winning. It's about understanding why you're playing. The plane landed at dawn. Rome was still wrapped in early morning fog, soft and golden, like the city had just woken up and hadn't put its makeup on yet. As I stepped out of the airport, the air smelled like espresso and old stone. That's when I saw it. A man holding a cardboard sign that said, "Miss Donovan." He looked to be in his 60s, tanned skin, a weathered face, and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You are Claire?" he asked, his accent thick but gentle. "Yes," I said cautiously. "And you are?" "My name is Marco. Your grandfather asked me to bring you." "My grandfather?" I blinked. He passed away." Marco nodded slowly. "Yes, but he made arrangements. Please, come." He led me to a black Fiat parked outside the terminal. The car smelled faintly of leather and pine. I watched the city blur past the window, ancient walls covered in ivy, tiny cafes spilling onto cobblestone streets, and locals shouting to each other in musical bursts of Italian. "Where are we going?" I finally asked. Marco smiled faintly. "Your grandfather's house. In Toscana." "Tuscany?" I repeated. "Wait, my grandfather had a house here?" Marco didn't answer. He just kept driving. 3 hours later, the landscape opened into rolling hills the color of honey. Vineyards stretched in every direction, the air thick with the scent of grapes and wet soil. When the car finally stopped, I stepped out onto a gravel path that led to an old stone villa perched on a hill. Shutters painted deep green, terracotta roof, a wide view of the valley that looked like a painting. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. "This was his?" I whispered. Marco nodded. "For many years." And then, as if remembering something, he reached into his coat and handed me the envelope I'd been waiting to open. I tore it open with shaking hands. Inside was a single handwritten note. 6 words. "Find what I left unfinished, Claire." That was it. No address, no instructions. Just that one line. Cryptic, familiar, like a riddle only he and I could understand. I turned to Marco. "What does this mean?" He looked away. "Perhaps you will know soon." Inside the villa, time paused. Dust coated the old piano in the corner. A faded photograph of a young man, Grandpa, sat on the mantel beside a chessboard. Mid-game, half-played, the Black King cornered but not yet captured. I walked from room to room, touching the furniture, the books, the history I didn't know existed. It was nothing like the corporate world my family worshipped. This house was real, alive with stories. And that's when I noticed something strange. On the far wall of the study, behind the glass of a framed photograph, was a small folded piece of paper. It looked deliberate, tucked just enough to be seen, but not enough to be obvious. I carefully took it out. Written in the same steady handwriting, "Ask for Lorenzo." That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the villa's balcony with a glass of cheap local wine, listening to crickets and trying to make sense of everything. Who was Lorenzo? What did Grandpa leave unfinished? Why me? For as long as I could remember, my family saw Grandpa as a ruthless businessman. But sitting here, surrounded by the life he'd built in secret, I realized maybe they never really knew him at all. Maybe this place, this villa, This message wasn't punishment. Maybe it was trust. At sunrise, Marco appeared again. He handed me a note. Different paper, same handwriting. Go to the village, it read. Find Lorenzo at the vineyard. So that's what I did. The town was small, a cluster of terracotta rooftops and narrow streets lined with flower pots. Locals greeted me with polite smiles. A stray cat followed me half the way, and then I saw the sign. Tenuta Eredita, family vineyard. The same last word from the wine bottle Grandpa once gave me on my 18th birthday. Eredita. Italian for inheritance. A man in his 40s stepped out from behind a row of vines, tall, sunburned, with dark eyes that looked like they'd seen everything. Posso aiutarci? He asked. I'm looking for Lorenzo, I stammered. He wiped his hands on his apron and smiled. You found him. I'm Claire Donovan, I said. My grandfather, he didn't let me finish. I know who you are. My heart skipped. You do? Lorenzo nodded. Roland Donovan told me you would come. He said, when she arrives, give her the truth. For a moment, I couldn't move. The truth? About what? But Lorenzo had already turned, gesturing for me to follow him deeper into the vineyard. The sun was climbing, casting golden light over the grapes and the hills, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just stepped into a story Grandpa had started decades ago. A story everyone else in my family had ignored. Whatever he'd left unfinished, whatever secret he'd buried here in Tuscany, I was about to find it. And something deep inside me whispered, This isn't the end of the game, Claire. It's your first real move. While my cousins were crying over the millions they just inherited at Grandpa's funeral, I stood there holding a crumpled envelope with my name written in his shaky handwriting. They got houses, companies, yachts. I got a single plane ticket. Everyone laughed that day. 6 months later, every single one of them would be begging me for help. But that day, I just stood there in the cold November air, wondering what kind of joke my grandfather was playing from beyond the grave. My name is Claire Donovan, and this is the story of how the worst day of my life became the start of something I didn't even know I was searching for. Grandpa always said life was a game of strategy. He played chess like it was war, slow, deliberate, always 5 moves ahead, and somehow, even in death, he was still playing. Before that day, my life was simple. I was 27, a high school literature teacher in Portland, grading essays at my kitchen table, and drinking $2 wine from a coffee mug. My apartment was small, my car older than my students, but for the most part I was content, but invisible. Especially to my family, because when you're a Donovan, you're expected to shine. You're expected to want the empire. And I didn't. Grandpa's company, Donovan Holdings, had its name on half the skyscrapers in Seattle. My uncles ran divisions of it. My cousins were born into stock options. But me? I traded boardrooms for blackboards. That choice made me the family disappointment. They never said it out loud, but you could see it in their eyes. At every family dinner, every Christmas gathering, every conversation that turned into a subtle comparison contest. While they discussed investments and acquisitions, I'd be asked things like, "So, Claire, still grading papers?" Still grading papers, as if teaching the next generation didn't matter. When Grandpa passed, I wasn't planning to go to the funeral. We hadn't spoken in almost 2 years, not since I turned down his offer to join the company. But Mom insisted. "He loved you in his own way," she said. "Go, say goodbye." So I drove 6 hours to Seattle in a car that rattled whenever it hit 60, sat through a funeral that felt more like a corporate event than a goodbye, and tried not to notice that even the flowers had been color coordinated to match the company logo. Then came the reading of the will. The room looked like something out of an old movie. Oak-paneled walls, heavy curtains, and that massive mahogany table Grandpa used to close his biggest deals. I sat near the end, far from the center of power, next to a vase of lilies that were already starting to wilt. Across from me, my cousin Madison was practicing her grieving heiress face, a perfect tear balanced under a $200 lash extension. Her brother, Evan, kept refreshing his phone like he was waiting for a stock update. Their parents, my Uncle Richard and Aunt Elaine, whispered about market reactions to the inheritance, as if Grandpa's death was just another business cycle. And then there was me. The teacher, the outsider, the one nobody took seriously. The family attorney, Mr. Alden, cleared his throat. Your grandfather was very specific about how this would be done. Madison rolled her eyes. Can we just skip to the part where we find out who gets what? Mr. Alden's expression didn't change. To my eldest son, Richard Donovan, and his wife, Elaine, I leave the primary residence and its contents. Elaine gasped softly, already picturing the mansion's chandelier with her name on it. To my grandson, Evan Donovan, control of Donovan Tech Investments. Evan smirked, like the universe had just confirmed what he'd always believed, that he was the chosen one. To my granddaughter, Madison Donovan, the Aspen property, and the trust therein. Madison let out a little squeal, already mentally shopping for ski boots, and then finally, to my granddaughter, Claire Donovan, Mr. Alden said, his voice softening in a way that made everyone else glance up. I leave this. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small white envelope. Laughter filled the room. You've got to be kidding, Evan said, leaning back in his chair. What, is that a sympathy card? Madison giggled. Maybe it's a coupon for her classroom. I didn't move. Didn't blink. Just took the envelope, my name written across it in Grandpa's careful script. It felt lighter than air. Inside, one folded sheet of paper and a single plane ticket, Rome. One way. Departure. 48 hours from now. The room went silent. Then Evan said, Seriously? She gets a vacation? Mr. Alden cleared his throat again. There's also a note, to be opened only upon her arrival. A note? Madison laughed. Oh, please. This is ridiculous. I slipped the ticket back into the envelope, feeling their eyes burning into me. Every instinct said to leave, to get in my car and drive back to my small, ordinary life. But something about that envelope, about the way Grandpa's handwriting curled around my name, felt like more than a farewell. It felt like a challenge. That night, sitting at my kitchen table, I placed the ticket beside my lesson plans and my stack of ungraded essays. Rome. I had $2,100 in my account, rent due in a week, and a car that could die any day. I should have thrown that ticket away, but I couldn't, because I could still hear Grandpa's voice from our last chess game. The best moves, Claire, are the ones your opponent never sees coming. And suddenly, for the first time in years, I wondered if maybe Grandpa hadn't left me nothing. Maybe he'd left me everything. The dirt road leading through the vineyard shimmered under the mid-morning sun. Lorenzo walked ahead of me, his steps steady and sure, like a man who'd been walking this same path his whole life. The scent of ripening grapes and crushed earth filled the air. Everything here felt alive, wild and deliberate at the same time. I couldn't help but ask, You said my grandfather told you I'd come. When? Lorenzo didn't turn. 3 years ago, I stumbled slightly on the uneven path. 3 years? But he only passed away 6 months ago. He nodded. He was prepared, said time doesn't wait for truth. It just buries it deeper. I didn't know what to say. Grandpa Roland, the man I thought I knew, had apparently been planning something for years, something that had nothing to do with shipping routes or balance sheets. The vineyard spread out in every direction, vines growing in perfect rows that looked endless. In the distance, a stone building sat on a hill, part farmhouse, part fortress. Lorenzo led me there, unlocking a heavy wooden door that creaked like it had secrets of its own. Inside, cool air and the scent of oak barrels surrounded us. It was beautiful, simple, grounded, and filled with the kind of quiet that money couldn't buy. He gestured toward a small office near the back. Your grandfather's things are here. He called it his workroom. I stepped inside and froze. On the desk sat a black and white photograph. My grandfather, decades younger, standing next to a woman I'd never seen before. She was stunning. Dark hair, soft eyes, holding a glass of wine. The way he looked at her was unmistakable. Who is she? I asked quietly. Lorenzo studied me for a long moment. Then he said softly, Her name was Isabella Rossi. She was the owner of this land before it became the vineyard. And she was the love of his life. The words hit me harder than I expected. My grandfather, the man who'd spent his life preaching discipline and sacrifice, had loved someone enough to build a secret world around her. But he was married, I whispered. Lorenzo nodded. To your grandmother, yes. In America. But long before that, he met Isabella here. During the war, he stayed for her. This place, if it was their dream, my heart twisted. Then why did he leave? Lorenzo sighed. Because love and duty are not always the same. He promised to return, and he did, every September for 1 week. For 50 years. I stared at the photograph again. All those family gatherings, the business meetings, the charity galas. While we were chasing status, he was quietly returning to a small vineyard in Tuscany to keep a promise no one else knew about. Lorenzo opened a drawer and pulled out a worn leather journal. The cover was cracked, the pages yellowed. He handed it to me without a word. Inside were notes in my grandfather's familiar handwriting. Sketches of grapevines, weather records, even poetry. And then, near the middle, a page marked with a ribbon. If the vines survive, the truth will too. She deserves to know. They all do. But not yet. Not until she's ready to understand what family really means. I traced the ink with my finger. The she had to be me. Lorenzo poured 2 glasses of deep red wine and handed one to me. This, he said, is the last vintage your grandfather personally oversaw. 2023. He called it heredità, inheritance. I took a sip. It was rich, warm, layered, like it carried every year of care and heartbreak with it. What did he mean by unfinished? I asked. Lorenzo set down his glass. This vineyard is more than a business. It's a legacy he built twice, once with his hands, once with his heart. But when Isabella died, he couldn't finish what they started. He wanted you to? Me? I laughed nervously. I don't know anything about vineyards. I teach history, he smiled faintly. Then maybe it's time to learn some. We spent the rest of the day walking through the vines. Lorenzo taught me how to tell when grapes were ready for harvest, how to read the soil, how to taste the air and know if rain was coming. By sunset, my shoes were covered in dirt, and my hair smelled like sun-warmed leaves, but I hadn't felt that alive in years. That night, Lorenzo drove me back to the villa. As we reached the front steps, he turned to me. Tomorrow, he said, you will meet someone important, someone who has been waiting for you. Who? I asked. He hesitated, then smiled. Your grandmother, I froze. That's impossible. My grandmother died before I was born. He shook his head. Not that one. Before I could ask another question, he got into his car and drove away, leaving me standing under a sky thick with stars, the word grandmother echoing through my mind. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept walking through the villa's hallways, touching the walls, the photographs, the past. On the piano, I found another envelope, smaller this time. My name written on the front in that same deliberate hand. I opened it carefully. Inside was a note written in Italian, Domani alle 10, Villa Monterey, tomorrow at 10, Monterey Estate. And beneath that, one last line in English. She knows the whole story. The next morning, a car was already waiting at the gate. Lorenzo wasn't driving this time. A younger man with sharp features and quiet eyes introduced himself as Nico. Your ride to Monterey, signorina, he said politely. As the car pulled away from the vineyard, I looked back one last time. The vines shimmered in the early light, and for a brief second, I could have sworn I saw him, my grandfather, standing at the edge of the field, smiling that same knowing smile he always had when he was about to win a game. I leaned back in the seat, heart racing as the road wound higher into the Tuscan hills. Somewhere ahead, a woman I'd never met was waiting for me. Someone who might hold the missing pieces of a story that started before I was even born. The words from his letter echoed again in my mind. Find what I left unfinished. Claire. And I had a feeling that when I did, nothing in my life would ever be the same again. The drive to Monterey Estate wound through hills so green they looked painted. Cypress trees lined the road like sentinels guarding a secret. Nico barely spoke, just hummed along with an old Italian song playing low on the radio. I pressed my forehead to the window and tried to steady my breath. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. When we turned a final corner, the villa came into view. Pale stone walls glowing gold in the morning sun, red-tiled roofs, terraces bursting with flowers. It didn't look like a house. It looked like a memory. Nico parked beneath an archway and opened my door. Inside, Signora is waiting. I followed him up marble steps to a pair of carved wooden doors. They opened before he could knock. An older woman stood there, elegant and poised, wearing a soft gray dress and a silver pendant that caught the light. Her hair was white, swept into a simple twist. But it was her eyes that made me stop. Steel blue, the exact same shade as my grandfather's. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she smiled through a shimmer of tears. "Clara Whitmore," she said softly, her accent delicate but precise. "You look just like him." My voice caught. You knew my grandfather?" Her smile trembled. "Knew him? Cara mia, I was his wife." The world tilted. I gripped the doorframe. "That's not possible." "My grandmother was Margaret," she finished gently. "The woman he married in America. But I was the woman he married first. Here, in Rome. Long ago." I blinked, trying to process the impossible. Nico quietly slipped away, leaving us alone. Sophia, that was her name, led me inside. The villa smelled of lavender and old paper. Sunlight streamed through high-arched windows, illuminating portraits that hung along the corridor. In every one, my grandfather was younger, freer, laughing beside her. We entered a sitting room with a grand piano and shelves of leather-bound books. "Sit, please," she said, motioning to an armchair. When I did, she poured 2 glasses of wine from a crystal decanter. "This was his favorite," she said. "He called it heredità, inheritance. Appropriate, no?" I took the glass, hands trembling. "Why didn't he ever tell us about you?" Sophia sighed. "Because he thought protecting everyone from the truth was the kindest thing he could do." She took a sip, eyes distant. "We met in 1948. He was stationed here after the war, helping rebuild the docks. He was brilliant, restless. He dreamed of ships that could reach every horizon. But he also dreamed of a vineyard, a place that would grow instead of conquer." Her gaze softened. "We married that autumn. He bought this land. We planted vines together. For a few years it was paradise." Then her smile faded, until duty called him home. His father's health failed. The company needed him. He promised to return within months. She looked at me steadily. "He came back, with a wedding ring from another woman." My throat tightened. He married her while still married to you?" Yes, it broke me at first, but I understood him more than anyone else did. He couldn't choose. So he built 2 lives, one of love, one of legacy. He spent his years shuttling between them, trying to balance the unbalanceable. She stood and crossed to an old oak desk. From a drawer, she withdrew a sealed envelope marked with my name in familiar, deliberate handwriting. "Before he died, he asked me to give this to you," she said. "He said you would be the one who'd understand." I broke the seal and unfolded the letter. His voice filled my head as I read. "My dear Claire, if you're reading this, you've chosen to trust me even without a reason. Good. You were always the one who asked why before judging how. Everything I built in America was meant to provide, but everything I built here was meant to heal. I spent half a century hiding from the truth, that the only legacy worth leaving is the one born of honesty. Sophia and I created this vineyard together, and it belongs to her family still. But I want you to continue what I couldn't. Bring both halves of my life together, not by money, but by meaning. You'll find documents in the safe beside this letter. The vineyard shares, the partnership deeds, the import rights, all under your name. Take them, protect them, grow them. But remember, the wealth isn't in the wine. It's in the people who make it. And if Preston calls, be kind. That will be your true inheritance. Grandpa Roland." By the time I finished, tears blurred the ink. Sophia touched my hand. "He talked about you often. Said you were the only one who ever listened without expecting anything in return." I tried to speak, but the words stuck. For the next 3 weeks, I stayed at Monterey Estate. Sophia insisted I learn everything. How the grapes were harvested, how the barrels aged, how the taste changed with the seasons. Her nephew Matteo ran daily operations, patient and soft-spoken. He taught me more about business and earth than any classroom ever had. Evenings, Sophia told stories, how Roland repaired the roof by hand after a storm, how he laughed when the first harvest failed, how he buried a small box under the oldest vine, for luck. When we dug it up, inside was a faded photograph of her and a chess piece, a white queen. I understood then. Every chess game he played with me had been practice for this, for knowing when to sacrifice the visible to protect what truly mattered. My last night there, we sat on the terrace, watching the sunset spill gold over the vineyard. Sophia poured 2 glasses of wine and raised hers. To secrets that turn into stories, she said. I smiled. And to stories that finally find their ending. She looked at me with a knowing sadness. Endings are just the start of a different chapter, cara mia. Then she reached into her pocket and handed me a key. To the cellar, she said. Your grandfather's final gift. Down in the cool stone cellar, I unlocked a small metal safe. Inside were business papers and another envelope. On it, 6 handwritten words. The truth only grows when shared. I closed my eyes, the words sinking deep. That was the message. That was the move I'd missed. When I returned upstairs, Sophia hugged me tightly. I am old, she whispered, but the vineyard will need young hands. Yours. I promised I'd return, not as a visitor, but as family. She smiled through tears. Then the circle is complete. The next morning, as the car carried me back toward Rome, the hills stretched wide and endless, and for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't running from my family's shadow. I was finally stepping into its light. When I landed back in Chicago, everything felt smaller. The airport, the sky, even the noise, like the volume had been turned down on a world that used to overwhelm me. Maybe that's what happens when you've seen something real. It makes everything fake shrink. The drive home was quiet. My apartment still smelled like coffee grounds and old books. My plants had somehow survived 3 weeks without me. A small miracle. On the kitchen table sat my laptop, blinking with missed messages. I hadn't told anyone what I found in Italy, not yet. Some truths need time to ripen, like grapes on a vine. I opened my phone. 33 missed calls from Preston. 12 from Aunt Diane, and 1 from an unknown number that somehow felt familiar. I pressed play on the first voicemail. Preston's voice was cracked, desperate. Claire, please call me back. Everything's falling apart. The company's... It's bad, Grandpa lied. The books are a mess. The bank froze our accounts. Dad's freaking out. Please, call me. I didn't. Not that night. Instead, I poured myself a glass of water and opened my grandfather's letter again. My eyes landed on the line I couldn't stop rereading. The truth only grows when shared. The next morning, I went to work like nothing had changed. But everything had. The students noticed first. Miss Whitmore, you're smiling, one of them said. I laughed. Guess I finally figured out my homework. 3 weeks later, Preston showed up at my apartment unannounced. His expensive suit looked rumpled for the first time in his life. Dark circles under his eyes. Can we talk? He asked quietly. I stepped aside and let him in. He looked around at my small kitchen, the mismatched chairs, the old corkboard covered with postcards. This is nice, he said, and I almost laughed. You didn't come here for an interior design tour, I said, crossing my arms. He sank into a chair like someone twice his age. Whitmore Shipping is done. The auditors found everything. The fake contracts, the loans, the offshore accounts. Grandpa covered for Dad for years. We're bankrupt, Claire. Completely. I stayed silent. He rubbed his face. Miller and Gray repossessed the house last week. Mom's been crying for days. Dad, he won't leave his office. He keeps saying this is punishment. Something in me softened. Maybe because I remembered my grandfather's letter. Be kinder to them than they were to you. What do you want from me, Preston? I asked gently. He hesitated. A chance. You inherited something real, didn't you? I nodded. A vineyard in Italy. He swallowed. I thought so. I want to work for you. He said it so quietly I almost missed it. I can't rebuild what we lost, but maybe I can build something honest this time. Please. I studied him. For once, there was no arrogance in his eyes. Just exhaustion. "All right," I said finally. "But you work for the vineyard, not me. We'll import the wine to the States. You'll handle logistics. Fair salary. No shortcuts." He looked stunned. "You'd really trust me?" "I'm just following Grandpa's last move," I said. And for the first time, Preston smiled. Not his public smile, but a real one. That was a year ago. Now every bottle of Heredità wine that ships to the U.S. passes through Preston's hands. He's good at it, careful, humble. Diane started volunteering at a shelter. Even Aunt Grace, the one who used to mock my teacher paycheck, started visiting my classes to talk about resilience. And me? I still teach, part-time now. The rest of the year, I live in Italy, helping Matteo modernize the vineyard. Sophia passed away quietly that spring, under the same cypress tree where she first met my grandfather. We buried her next to the vine they planted together. The day after her funeral, Matteo handed me a small wooden box with her initials carved on top. "She wanted you to have this," he said. Inside was the white queen from my grandfather's old chess set, the same one I'd found buried beneath the vineyard. Taped beneath it was a note in Sophia's handwriting. "The queen can move anywhere she wants, but only when she stops being afraid to move at all." I didn't cry right away. I just sat there, staring at that tiny symbol of every lesson they'd both left me. Last week, I flew back to Chicago for a wine convention. Preston was there, representing Heredità Wines USA. He wore the same suit he once bragged about, only this time, it looked like workwear, not armor. After the event, he walked up and handed me a bottle. The label read, "Heredità 2025. The truth only grows when shared." He smiled. "We bottled the phrase just like you said." I nodded, the lump in my throat making words impossible. That night I went home and placed the bottle on my windowsill. City lights reflected in the glass, shimmering like stars in deep red wine. I thought about my grandfather, about the envelope, the ticket, the laughter at that funeral, about how everyone thought I'd lost, but I hadn't lost anything. I'd just been moved to a different board, because sometimes the smallest gift, a plane ticket, a folded letter, 6 words, can rewrite everything you thought you knew about love, family, and legacy. And as I sat there, the city humming softly below, I whispered the words that had followed me across oceans and generations. The truth only grows when shared. That was the real inheritance. Not land, not money, not even wine, but the courage to trust that some endings are just beginnings wearing clever disguises.